Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Alaska State Library's Archives and Museum. My name is Addison Field. I'm the Chief Curator of the Alaska State Museum. Please be advised we are recording this evening's program for air on KTOO, your local television station. So please silence your cell phones. And I'd like to acknowledge that we are gathered here this evening on the unceded land of the Yaqu peoples. I ask you to join me in acknowledging the Yaqu community, their elders, both past and present, as well as future generations. The Alaska State Library's Archives and Museums acknowledges that Alaska was founded upon exclusions and erasures of many indigenous peoples, including those on whose land this institution is located. It is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening. He comes from a tree-lined studio high on a hill above the Tongass Narrows in rain-swept Ketchikan, Alaska. In that studio, Ray Troll draws and paints fishy images that migrate into the museums, swim into books and magazines, and spawn shirts sold in stores around the planet. He brings a street-smart sensibility to the works of ichthyology and paleontology. Ray's unique blend of art and science have led him to the Alaska State Museum for a third time. With this exhibit based on the book he wrote with Dr. Kirk Johnson, Cruisin the Fossil Coastline. Dr. Kirk Johnson and Dr. Ray Troll were awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship for development of the book that grew into this exhibit. Ray and his wife, Michelle, run the Soho Coho Gallery in Ketchikan. I'd like to say thanks to the Anchorage Museum, who organized the exhibit, Ramada by Wyndham, and the Friends of the Alaska State Library's Archives and Museums, without whom this program tonight would not be possible. Ladies and gentlemen, the Ratfish Wrangler, Ray Troll.
Well, thank you. This is really super cool to be here, and thank you so much. It's my third show here at the museum, and what a beautiful new museum this is. And it's an extraordinary place and a very special place to be. And I'm really, there's so many people to thank. But also, I just especially want to thank my family who showed up here tonight, my two kids, get all teary-eyed. My beautiful wife, Michelle, my sister, Kate, her husband, Bill, my niece, Erin, and my nephew-in-law, Andrew, and all the rest of the friends and neighbors and all the Southeast Alaskans who you guys have put up with me and my crazy stuff over all these years and worn my T-shirts. That's where they went. Now, my T-shirts are all missing, but anyways, thank you so much. Give them back. So this is so cool to have this exhibit here at the Anchorage Museum. Indulge my big dream that I had to have an exhibit come out of this book that I did with Kirk, my buddy for 25 plus years now. And it's been up in the Anchorage Museum. It's opened there in 2017, and then it went down to Oakland, kind of shrank, kind of did a California version at the Oakland Museum. Now it's here, and hopefully we're going to get it down to Seattle next year. But without any further ado, I just want to jump into some of the cool creatures that you're going to see here. And I think I also want to wander around a little bit. I'll have this big microphone here. Indulge me. There it comes. There it is. I can wander around now. All right. So actually, as we get started here, I want to get you oriented in geologic time. And this is a chart that I did for the previous book I did with Kirk Johnson. And this is from the Cruisin the Fossil Freeway book. And I've also written a song with the Ratfish Wranglers to help you learn your geologic ages. But I think it's very important for people to know what the past is really all about, because the only way we can understand what's going on here in the world today is to know what's happened in the past and the tremendous changes that the Earth has been through over these millions and billions of years. So also speaking of some of the terrible the terrible things that have happened in the past, there have been 5 major extinctions in the planet. And most scientists, most paleontologists, and actually many scientists now believe that we are in the 6th extinction right here. Most folks know about the end Cretaceous extinction that took out 76% of life in the planet. Few people know about the Triassic extinction that happened here at the end of the Triassic. But the biggest extinction event ever to hit the planet, 96% of life on the Earth disappeared at the end of the Permian at the beginning of the Triassic, when the Mesozoic era began. But just to help you learn your geologic ages, I came up with this mnemonic device. It's, I think, also kind of very uniquely Alaskan. Crusty old sourdoughs make perfect pancakes, toast, juice, and coffee. So that gets you through the Cambrian, Ordovician, Silurian, Devonian, Mississippian, and so on. And then also in a very uniquely Alaskan kind of thing, too, to help you through your Cenozoic years. Paleontologists earned oil money perfecting prehistoric history. There, Ray Troll is totally sold out right there. He's wearing a Shell t-shirt there. But I drew this. This one is a brand new one that I did for the Cruisin the Fossil Coastline book with Kirk. And I got to say, I have known Dr. Johnson since I first met him in 1993 when I had an exhibit at the Burke Museum. There's a younger Ray Troll, and there's Kirk Johnson, who weirdly enough never seems to age at all. But this is our first book, Cruisin the Fossil Freeway. And I was at Kirk and Chase when he married his beautiful wife, Chase. Let's see. And this is at that wedding, and we took a break from the dance floor. No, I wasn't dancing with Kirk, but does look like we're joined at the head there. But he was at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science at the time when we first met, and he said, "Man, I love your T-shirts." That was the first words out of his mouth. "You're that guy. You do T-shirts. I didn't know you did paleo stuff. Got to get your exhibit out to the Denver Museum." And sure enough, in 1999, the exhibit was able to go out to the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. And we decided to do a book together, and that was the Cruisin the Fossil Freeway book. And then we said, well, we had an exhibit that happened that grew out of the Fossil Freeway book, and that was back at the Burke Museum where we'd first met. So that show was there in 2009. And when we worked in that show, we realized, wait a minute, we're starting another book, aren't we? So there's this whole western coast that we've ignored, really. And actually, this is where Kirk grew up. Kirk actually grew up in Bellevue and born and raised there. And I'm an Air Force brat and moved all over the place with my siblings till I think Kate and Tim. They argue about who came first to Alaska, but 4 of us ended up here in Alaska. But Kirk now, in the middle of this book project, just as we were wrapping up the very last trip in the book, he applied to actually be the director of the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History, and he got the job. So that kind of slowed. It was really cool, but it also slowed down production on the book. So, but here are our heroes now. They're in a boat called the Naquasina, which a friend of mine has a boat called the Naquasina. It's not an old trawler like this, so that's artistic license. There's a nice geologic hammer and a trilobite there and a paintbrush there, kind of forming the union of the sciences and the arts. And many of the creatures that are featured in the exhibit. And if we can see them there a little bit closer. That's not a bear in the bow, by the way. That is a ground sloth, a giant ground sloth. And here's another view of our heroes. And actually, here's another view of our 2 intrepid heroes, the scientist and the artist. And when I was working on the book with Kirk, he said, well, we're going to have the portraits in the front here. I'm going to tell your life story, Mr. Troll, in 7 words, I guess, right? Kansas hippie paints fish in the rain. So I spent a lot of my formative years in Kansas, and yes, the 60s were really good to me. And Kirk's story is coastal creationist kid finds rocks and evolution. And his backstory is that he was born and raised in Bellevue, but his parents were Seventh-day Adventists. That's the church group that came up with the idea of creationism, the whole idea that to literally interpret the Bible and that creation happened in just a mere week. And it was maybe that fascination with the origin of the earth and this religion that he was raised in that made him really look more closely at the earth. And he still goes to the church, and he's got on friendly terms with everybody, but he's by no means a Seventh-day Adventist anymore. But actually, so if you look at this too, we have our totemic animals in this drawing. And his totemic animals, both living and prehistoric, the living animal is the walrus, and then his favorite prehistoric thing is the creature is the ammonite, and then mine is a flaming trilobite, and then the ratfish. But as you go through the exhibit, you'll actually see that there are trilobite ammonites kind of in equal play all throughout the show. So whenever we run into a walrus, we must stop and pay homage to the walrus and take a silly picture with the walrus, with Kirk. And actually, he loves them so much that I photoshopped those in there. And the reason he loves them so much is when he was working his master's degree, he actually worked on a walrus research boat out in the Bering Sea. So he became absolutely fascinated with these fantastic animals that we associate with the Arctic. But I'm going to show you a few other walruses here as we go through this. I don't know if you guys have ever noticed the Arctic building in Seattle, Washington, down near the Smith Tower, about 2nd and Cherry Street. But the thing is covered with walruses. It's just a fascinating building. I'd love to go down there and just check this out and get the telephoto lens, get all the walruses lined up. But there's walruses all around that building. It's really cool. And the time has come, the walrus said, to speak of many things, of shoes and ships and sealing wax, of cabbages and kings, and why the sea is boiling hot and whether pigs have wings. And yeah, there's the Beatles right there. And so that's my homage to walruses there. But actually, once upon a time in the prehistoric West, along the West Coast, there were a great menagerie of animals that some look familiar and others are very, very strange looking. There actually were many, many varieties of walrus in the prehistoric past, some with 4 tusks, like this little beastie here called Gomphataria, shows up every now and then. But there were many varieties. This is also a tuskless walrus over here, and one of gigantic proportions right here. Megalodon was chewing on whales half its size back in the Miocene and the Oligocene and Miocene seas in the Cenozoic era. And here's some other walruses up there. But these walruses are found all down in the southern areas of Southern California. And we usually associate them with the North Pacific, the very far North Pacific and the Arctic. But there's Gomphataria, the 4-tusked walrus, looking at you. And here's some walruses flying by some roadside dinosaurs in Southern California. Little scientific surrealism there for you. Another one of the fantastic beasts that are actually the book begins and ends with this weird shark that I worked on for many, many years, became real fascinated with. This is a spiral of shark teeth. We don't go into the story of the shark so much. It's covered in some other books that I've done. But it's a beast called Helicoprion. But I was delighted to find out, as we worked in the book, that Helicoprion fossils have been found along the West Coast, but also was delighted to finally find out that there were a couple of fossils of Helicoprion also found in Alaska. So I was just thrilled to wow, we can put them in here now. And this beautiful spiral of teeth, I first ran into this when I was working in the book with Brad Mattson, and just really wanted to figure out where in the heck this strange spiral of teeth went. And that led to a whole kind of side project that I did with the Idaho Museum of Natural History. But one of the things I like to do are do renderings of all the interpretations of where people thought the world of teeth went. So this is every wrong version ever done of the buzzsaw shark is what we call it now. And it's been festooned on the tail, up on the upper snout, and the hanging from the lower snout. My friend Russell Wodehouse thought maybe it was a pizza cutter. You can imagine that it could whip those teeth out like that. But no, I was actually, my curiosity helped gather a bunch of scientists, and we finally worked together on it. So an artist and a bunch of scientists collaborated. We did some CT scans and some really important fossils. The CT scans showed this, that spiral teeth was located in the lower jaw of the shark, and it's a large shark. And the upper jaw has got flat crushing teeth, and it used this is sort of this is a cutaway view. So this is in the center of the lower jaw, and it used that like an ulu knife and a cutting board to slice its prey in two. That is just badass cool. And they're big. So I proposed that we do an exhibit on that, and lo and behold, we did do an exhibit on that. And my friend Gary Staub, and of course, everything looks cooler crashing through a wall and with flames. So we did this big, gigantic version of that. But some of these whorls or teeth are greater than 2 feet across, and if you fit that into the lower jaw of the shark, that means you've got a 20 to 30 foot long shark. But so that kind of begins and ends the book, but really the superstar of the book ended up being this beastie here. And maybe tonight was your first introduction when you walk into the exhibit, but this is an animal that's called desmostylis, the desmostylians. So desmostylis is one of the first species ever found. Actually, they've known about this animal for over 100 years, and paleontologists have known about it, but Kirk and I decided that we really must popularize this beast. These are the teeth of a desmostylus. Desmo meaning group and stylus meaning pillars. So like a little 6-pack of teeth here. If you look at that, it looks like a little 6-pack, at least in my mind. But these belong to an order of marine mammals. And we started just calling them desmos for short, so we dubbed that. So actually, the name seems to be sticking, so desmos just sounds cool. But one of the strange things, not only are their teeth so weird, there's been a lot of speculation because their bones are so oddly proportioned and fit together in these really weird fashions. There's been a lot of, once again, just like Helicoprion, there's been a lot of conjecture with these scientific papers. Reppening publishes this paper wherein he postulates that these weird marine mammals sat around like giant frogs, if you will, along the coast. And these are marine mammals that were found only in the North Pacific. They flourish for about 20 million years, and then they vanish from the fossil record. They're gone. One of the theories is that sea cows eventually replaced them in the oceans of the North Pacific. But they range from Baja, Mexico, all the way up the coast and over to Japan. And so the Japanese have beautiful specimens of desmostylians, but they have very different ideas. And there's almost like this little battle going on between the Japanese and the Americans and the British, once again, but it's over the posture of the desmostylians. So it's an obscure little battle that's been going on, and I love this stuff. So Shikama comes back in 1966, and he says, no, they were bow-legged, like this. But then Shikama has doubts. You can see the doubts are growing. In 1968, he publishes, well, maybe it was more like so. They were sort of bent a little backwards and the knees back here. But then Savage from the British Museum jumps in, and he says, well, maybe it was more of a frog-like thing, but they could sit like this. But not to be outdone, it goes on. Hasegawa comes back in 1977. The Japanese are really into, no. They had these massive bellies, and they could barely crawl around. So Hasegawa has this guy sort of like a sumo warrior, crouching like that. Reppening gets into it, and he says that they could swim around like polar bears. They have these gigantic hands. Dominic gets into it, and he says in 2002 they could walk around sort of like on their tippy toes. And he's from the Smithsonian. And then Inuzuka in 2005, this is the last shot, he says, no, they crawled around on their bellies. But Kirk and I began to just become fascinated and obsessed with desmostylians. And we fell in love with these little beasties. And I just imagine vast herds of them along the Pacific coast, bellowing in the night. Can you imagine if you were all desmostylians? And they had these massive big tusks and big teeth. And there are many, many varieties of desmostylians, the many genera, many species. If they're only still around, we could go surfing with them, surfing with the desmos. And yes, they were out there with the megalodon sharks, and every now and then one would be bitten in two by a megalodon. Oh, the North Pacific was such a different place then. But yes, they ranged up into Alaska, and this is a species that was named in 2015, Unalaska tomidae. Unalaska is a Aleutic name, and this one is a very massive beast, and of course, there is a lovely full-size sculpture of one in the other room that my friend Gary Staub sculpted, especially for the exhibit. That is the Alaskan species, Unalaska stylus tomidae. And there was actually individuals were found. There's actually, look in one of the cases over there, some baby tusks and some juvenile tusks. So we know that there was actually a whole colony of them near Dutch Harbor. And every now and then in my notebooks, I just do these little doodles, and they don't make it into the book. And so here's one. It doesn't really make any sense. I thought it was kind of funny. Rastafarians, Pastafarians, and desmostylians. It didn't make it into the book. But you guys know about the Pastafarians, right? This flying spaghetti monster. So anyways, it turns out the latest analysis actually shows that the desmostylians might actually be the closest living relatives would actually be horses. And these are extinct, but rhinoceroses. So they did classically think they're more closely related to elephants, but the latest analysis shows them being closest to horses. And there were two types of the desmostylians. They split into the Paleoparadoxidae, which means prehistoric thing that we don't understand, and the Desmostylidae. So there are many species along there, but you can actually think of them as, actual seahorses with big tusks. And every now and then, Michelle has maybe had a little bit enough. This is a woman perturbed by the giant doxy. But here's Kirk Johnson himself inside the mouth of Unalaska tomidae, that sculpture that's in the other room. Here's another weird beastie from the book. These are a bunch of graduate students at the University of Oregon in Eugene. They've since moved on, and some of them have jobs in different museums now. So they've all graduated. Actually, he's running the John Day Fossil Beds right now. And Amy is also the curator at the Museum of the Rockies now. But they are holding a slab of a prehistoric salmon. And that prehistoric salmon is called Oncorhynchus rastrosus. And those are the vertebrae from Oncorhynchus rastrosus. It is it's in the it's a sister species of a sockeye. I am not making this up. People are looking at me like, is this real? Those are the vertebrae. And check out the growth rings in those right there. It looks like 3 big growth rings. And these are basically, they are very large salmon that had big gill rakers. They had twice as many gill rakers as a sockeye salmon. So they were probably planktonic feeders, but they had these massive fangs. And this is down in the LA County Museum. The San Diego Museum has got specimens too, just as big. And these are like marlin-sized salmon, anadromous as well. So, but the first fossils are found in eastern Oregon. And this is maybe a little bigger, but can you imagine the fillets on this thing? I mean, it's a sockeye. Sister species of the sockeye. And, of course, we did a large sculpture of it down, and I did a mural with my buddy Memo Haragi and then Gary Staub. This is part of my crew that I usually work with. And we did this at the University of Oregon, and we were calling it the saber-tooth salmon, and that's what all the early fossils showed. It was a saber-tooth, and they're hanging down like that. But then, lo and behold, about 5 years ago, they found another fossil site, and there was an entire school of saber-tooth salmon that were fossilized in situ, like all together, and every single one of them, the skulls showed that the fangs pointed absolutely sideways, which was like, oops. Now what do I call it? So I'm starting to just call it the spike-tooth salmon, and that seems to fit, because what are those spikes about? What are the fangs about? You know, they're not for biting, and actually exactly that. They're doing that in the stream, and we've all watched salmon in the stream doing that. And those fangs, if you look at a dog salmon, those fangs are actually sort of pointing outwards, not really down. And those fangs in a dog salmon, which are also planktonic feeders, when they get into the streams, they are fighting for territory, and they're also digging beds to lay the eggs in. So it's got a dual purpose, and it's sort of ridiculously proportioned. But I had to actually do a lot of photoshopping to correct all of my mistaken versions. Seriously, this is all like science. So this is another beastie. It's mentioned in the book. It's actually this is Dale Guthrie, who's a very famous paleontologist from the University of Alaska Fairbanks. Kirk and I spent a couple days with Dale and his family. They're just incredible people. I think it was in the 1960s. I had all the dates up here in my head, but now they've flown out of my head. In the 1960s, there was a mummified steppe bison that was found just north of Fairbanks, and Dale Guthrie ended up being the guy that did the work on it. And he realized it's a steppe bison, so it's bison priscus, very beautifully preserved beast. And actually, this is so beautifully preserved that it's actually got the bite marks on it from the lions that killed it. And this is one of the most beautifully preserved mummified creatures in the world. It's estimated to be about 35,000 years old. And when it was exposed to air, there's this substance on it called vivianite, a mineral. And when that oxidizes, it turns it a bright blue. And they dubbed it Blue Babe. And he was able to theorize, to actually show that there were bite marks right on the snout of Blue Babe, and that's how modern day lions will take down wildebeest. It will like suffocate them by biting right on the snout, and the exact bite marks are there. And there are claw marks and bites on the back of Blue Babe too. But also the meat was preserved, and of course paleontologists are gonna I wonder what that tastes like. So they cooked it up in a stew one night at the Guthrie house, and everybody ate it, and everybody went, and they asked Dale what did it taste like, and he said, mud. So this is my drawing. Blue Babe Blue ended up in the stew. Sounds like a song. There's the lions about that, So that's on display at the UAF Museum of the North. Ammonites. There's a really lovely ammonite section in the exhibit. As I said, Kirk is an ammonite fanatic. They're related to modern-day squid. Some people call octopus naked ammonites. So we know basically they're octopus. They think of octopus or ammonites without shells. But they go extinct at the very end of the Cretaceous along with the dinosaurs and the big marine reptiles. And the name Ammonite comes from the Egyptian god, the ram-headed god with the spiral horns. So nobody's ever done the drawing. I had to do the drawing of the Ammonites in the Temple of Ammon. So that's also in the book. Some of the most beautiful ammonites in the world are found in Vancouver Island. All throughout the island, just beautiful Cretaceous deposits. But this Cretaceous deposit also continues up into Alaska in the Matanuska Valley, and the fossils that are in the hall out there from the Matanuska Valley, up in the mountains, the Talkeetna Mountains. So these ocean creatures are coming from the tops of the mountains. And some of the ammonites were these beautiful saxophone paperclip shaped ammonites. Rather extraordinary looking. And these are, I just love to just do these sort of downloads. Sometimes I sit down with a paleontologist and just say, give me every animal in the ocean at the time. So I'll write them all down, and then I'll put them in this one big drawing, just dump them in there. And this is pretty much everything I could find that's been dug up on Vancouver Island from the late Cretaceous, including the ratfish right there, giant coelacanths, mosasaurs, plesiosaurs. They've even found vampire squid fossils and Dumbo octopus fossils, and these beautiful, gigantic, heteromorph ammonites. So there's a close-up of some of these beautiful ammonites.
And there's the modern-day nautilus, which is a distant relative of ammonites that are still alive in the oceans today. There's 2 species of those left in the world. Jim Bechtel. You guys know Jim Bechtel, don't you? Forest Service geologist, a legendary dude with a massive beard. And his beard enters the room first, usually. And cool guy, Forest Service geologist. And Jim and I, over the years, had many fossil adventures. And when work came up, we went out with Jim. I introduced the 2 of them. We went over to an island near the towns of Cake and Petersburg, kind of giving you vague directions. But if you look for the Triassic black rock, these lovely layers, whenever I see layers like this, I get all excited because I know there might be fossils in there. But you can walk up and down that beach all day, and only somebody with a really good eye and knows what the fossils look like can point out that there's a rib bone right there on the beach. And that rib bone is from Barth's boat. This is Barth. That was Barth, my buddy Barth there in that picture, and pointing to the rib bone right there. And Barth has the boat, the Naquasina, and there's the Naquasina right there. But that's a rib bone of an animal, an ichthyosaur, found on the islands in southeast Alaska. And these are all the fauna that have come from that one island in southeast Alaska. And actually, that outcrop also shows up in other spots throughout southeast Alaska. And then in 2013, we came down and we found the same bones on the outside of Gravina Island, right across from Ketchikan. And there's a whole variety of Triassic beasts that are being dug up there. This is a thalattosaur that is yet to be named. This is a smaller ichthyosaur. This is a very large ichthyosaur. And ichthyosaur means fish lizard. And now, moving along to something completely different. I asked 100 people. We actually did this down at the gallery. What are bears related to? What's the closest mammal group to bears? And you get the exhibit now, so you know the answer, right? But this is what most people think, what are bears related to? And 25% said dogs and wolves, 20% said raccoons, wolverines, 15% said humans, apes, and monkeys. And I was shocked at that. But really? But people think that. And I think one of the reasons they think that is that, when you skin out a bear, kind of like a human. I've heard that. But 8% said cats and lions, 7% said pigs, 3% had the right choice. Seals, sea lions, and walruses are actually basically aquatic bears. And that story of that marine mammal evolution is told in the rocks here in Southeast, but also one of my favorite things in the exhibit is lining up all those bear skulls, the couple of bear skulls next to a sea lion skull. But these are the living bears up there, and then the pinnipeds branch off. And right here, you'll notice there's a branch. It's called the oyster bear. And the oyster bear, they found the skull in Oregon and Washington, and also one from Alaska now. There's only 3 that have ever been found, and a few of the bones. But it's probably one of the missing links between the bears and the ocean-going bears, the pinnipeds, basically the seals and sea lions. I think of them as bears down at the other end of the creek that started going out into the water. Notice here, too, there's a group that's called the bear dogs, sort of halfway between the bears and the dogs. So I love doing these evolutionary trees. And there's the oyster bear. If the oyster bear walked into an oyster bar, that one made it into the book. But that's that case in Anchorage, and this is laid out there. So this is a giant short-faced bear found in Esther, Alaska, twice the size of the brown bear, the Kodiak brown bear right next to it. Look at that. That's a Pleistocene bear that lived in Alaska up until 10,000 years ago. But there is the brown bear next to a sea lion skull, next to the four-tusked walrus. So there's another evolutionary tree. You guys may not know that dugongs and sea cows are actually kind of aquatic versions, splitting off from the elephant family tree. And the whale family tree is very interesting, too, because once upon a time, whales did walk upon the land. Ambulocetus, walking whale. These whales, fossils of the walking whales have been found in Pakistan and India. And it's really exciting news that they've now found a walking whale in South America, a fossil from the Eocene in South America, in a desert in Peru. So paleo geeks are really excited about that. But the closest land mammal to whales, hippopotamus, which is pretty mind-blowing. So they split off a long, long time ago from the hippopotamus clan, so they have a common ancestor with them. But I love doing these evolutionary trees, and then as I was working on the book, I said, wait a minute. That means that there's four mammals linked to the sea. You've got the horse with the desmostylians. You get the bear with the sea lions and walruses and seals. You got the hippopotamus with the whales, and you've got elephants with the manatees and the dugongs. So I did this little drawing, four land mammals linked to the sea. So these are mammalian groups that went back to the sea. Yeah, whale fossils. This is a little bit of this is Ed Ricketts' lab in California, and this is a Capitola Beach. This is Bobby Bosenecker, a paleontologist who joined us when we were wandering around California. But there's so many whale fossils along the beach in California that's pretty crazy. And even as you walk down to Capitola Beach, there's whale fossils in the wall on the way down. As you get down to the beach is covered with all kinds of fossils. But few people notice, like the whale skull right there on the beach, the 20 million year old whale skull. And can you see it in this picture here? There's Kirk and Bobby over there. But do you see this line of vertebrae right there? Look at the rocks a little bit closer next time you go to the beach in Washington or Oregon. And this is in Capitola Beach. And here's Bobby literally standing right by a very large prehistoric whale skull right there. And it just looks like another rock. And there were surfers right to the right. And I was like, hey, guys, look at these vertebrae right here. And they're like, yeah, whatever. So anyways, we worked our way up through Oregon. We worked our way up over to the Painted Hills in Oregon. We went over to the John Day fossil beds. We went through a town called Fossil. And I thought it's so cool to be in a town called Fossil because you get all these fossil jokes you can make because there's a fossil police and there's the fossil hardware store, the fossil bar, you know. And then my favorite, too, was fossil Bible study. There is the perfect synthesis, isn't it? Fossil Bible Fellowship. Yeah. So it reminds me of a joke that Brad Mattson once told me. He said, well, we were like, creationists sometimes push against science museums and say, we'd really like to have a different interpretation if you would allow us to maybe have a section that talks about creationism in the science museum. And some museums, I know at the Denver Museum, they allow creationist groups to come through. It's open to the public and, and to actually do their own tours through the exhibit, interpret it in their own way. And then Brad and I were thinking, well, that's kind of weird, but maybe every church would have like a little fossil area in it. So to talk about these other ways to look at the world. But here it is, Fossil Bible Fellowship. It's our buddy Ted Fremd with a killer pig lower jaw right there from eastern Oregon. And the Ratfish Wranglers have a song about this called Hell Pig. And also out in eastern Oregon, there are bear dogs, and some of the bear dogs are very tiny, and they were arboreal. So that's a tiny tree-dwelling bear dog called Synarctoides. So it's about Chihuahua size, and the theory is they lived in the trees, and so I did this drawing, Tree Dog Night. Thank you very much. And I'm very sorry. Washington State, one of the coolest fossil sites is out in eastern Oregon. And there is Kirk Johnson for scale right there. We went out to Blue Lake in eastern Washington. Kirk had always wanted to do this. And if you look at this, in eastern Washington, it has just been scoured by lava flows over the years. Very few fossils ever found. This is basalt. All of it, just lava flow, volcanic. You would never, ever find a fossil in that, or would you? So it turns out in about 1940, there were a couple of hikers that were looking for petrified trees. Sometimes petrified trees are found in the middle of these lava flows. So the lava was flowing and actually flowed over the landscape, and it would trap these trees and it would petrify them. So every now and then you could find a petrified tree in there. And they found a hole going into the lava rocks, the basalt, and they climbed in there, and then they realized, wait a minute, there were bones in the bottom of this hole that they crawled into, and they realized it was actually the shape of a rhinoceros. And the bones were and they had found the bones in the bottom, and they actually took the bones out, and sure enough, they sent them off to Berkeley, where they still sit to this day, and they were identified as a prehistoric rhinoceros. And they realized this was an upside-down rhinoceros laying on its back, and it had been deep fried by the basalt. It had been covered in lava, and just like Pompeii, it was a rhinoceros-shaped cave. And you can actually climb up the side of that scree slope, which completely panicked me. So if you look at Rachel, and there's this little narrow path that you could get, this is like beyond 45 degrees, that's like 300 feet down. And I crawled up that scree slope, and I was right about there, and I totally lost my mind. I couldn't go up or down. Kirk had to pry me off the rock, and I came over, and then you climb over here, and then you're supposed to go up another 8 or 9 feet, and you climb through the rear end of the rhinoceros. Yeah, you climb through the ass to get into the rhinoceros cave. And I wasn't about to do that, but I did this drawing. Troll bravely struggled upwards to the Blue Lake rhino, but the deep-fried rhino. Things went from bad to worse one day for the rhino on that fateful day, oh so long ago. So there is the rhino. Ah, no, volcano. So it's in the book. There's another cool fossil that was found in Washington State, a bloat and float tyrannosaur on Susha Island. It's the only dinosaur bone ever found in Washington State. It's like the thigh bone of a tyrannosaur that was found on Sushi Island, and amongst the marine fossils on Susha Island and the San Juan Islands. And that's on display at the Burke Museum. And everything looks cooler crashing through the wall. That's my buddy Ryan Kenny from the Anchorage Museum, and actually we recreated this here. Bob Banghart came in and did some of the sheetrock work for us. It was a real pleasure working with the whole exhibits crew here and the volunteers that helped paint the wall. There's the trilobite couch, the Alaska fossils, California fossils, and I think I'm going to zero in on the very last part of this. I think I'm sorry, I've loaded the longer version of this talk onto the laptop here tonight by mistake, but I will leave you on this. At the very end of the book, is just as we're wrapping up the book, I was asked to do an evolutionary tree, like the tree of life, for this fellow right over here. His name is Chuck Baxter, and he's one of the guys who helped found the Monterey Bay Aquarium. And some of the folks from the aquarium approached me and said, Chuck is going to turn 90 years old. We were really he's really into, the tree of life and actually figuring out where all these organisms, how they're all related. Would you do a special drawing for him? And I did a special drawing for him, and this is that drawing. And, of course, we have Ed Ricketts and Steinbeck's boat over here, the Western Flyer. But it's really such an extraordinary thing when you think about it, and that life has only occurred once in this planet. We are related to everything, as Joni Mitchell sang so beautifully all those years ago. We are stardust. We are golden. We're animated dirt, for crying out loud. But life, from ashes to ashes and dust to dust, it gets all cosmic and heavy. But we're all related to everything in the world. But basically, life has happened once, as near as we can figure out. The only thing that doesn't quite fit neatly into the evolutionary tree, and this was driving all the biologists wild, is that there is the group that's called the ctenophores, and there's still a big question mark. They don't seem to really fit into the tree of life at all, and there's a big question mark as to where in the heck did they come from, because they don't fit comfortably into the niche. And maybe there's a possibility that life started twice. That's how strange they are, the ctenophores. But as you journey up this tree, there's some pretty profoundly weird things when you start looking at it. So I worked with Chuck Baxter. They gave this drawing to him. My friend Grace Freeman did the beautiful digital coloring on this, but there was like 5 or 6 other scientists that helped me work on this. so that all these trees and branches were at the the very correct spot, the very subtle things here. But we, the vertebrates, are most closely allied. The closest group to us are the echinoderms, which are basically your sea stars, your crinoids, your sea squirts, your sea cucumbers, your sea urchins, as your sea stars. But basically, there's this group here, the hemichordates and the sea squirts. And basically, we are the spawn of wayward sea squirts. So that if you read all the literature, you dive into it, we are the wayward spawn of tunicates. And as the wayward spawn would go out into the waters, those little wayward spawns began to develop backbones. So we are the spawn of tunicates, which are all out there in the ocean. And as those tunicates began to develop those little backbones, they were the first fishy creatures. And really, the vertebrates are all variations on fish. So as the fish migrated and split and began to diversify, there was a group called the lobe-fin fishes that did crawl up out of the oceans and onto the land and became the amphibians and the reptiles and the mammals and on up. And actually, I want to show you something really weird. I like to ask you, like, what's the closest group? So what's the closest group to vertebrates? Echinoderms. So that's the closest group, as you go up. We're all variations on fish, so everything splits. The amphibians, the reptiles, birds, mammals, and man, they all come from those wayward fish, the lobe-fin fish that left the oceans. And then, what's the closest group to primates? What's the sister group? There's this little weird animal called a colugo. I want to raise your colugo consciousness. It says colugos, if you back up on the tree here and you look, primates up here, where are we at? So there's the carnivores, and up here we have the primates there. But there's a little sister group right there, kind of splitting off, but the sister group to the primates. They used to think it was bats were the closest. So but in between bats and primates, there's this strange little group of animals called the colugo found in the forests of Southeast Asia, and some of the latest genetic analysis shows that, yes, they're the closest. They're called lemurs, tree lemurs, but flying lemurs, but they're not actually lemurs because lemurs are primates. This is a sister group called the colugo, and I think they're just so cute and weird and bizarre. They're like little flying humans in the forests of Southeast Asia. So there you've had a strange and terrible journey through the mind of Ray Troll. With that, you've had enough. Thank you. Thanks. I hope that's all perfectly clear, right? They told me we could do a little bit of Q&A. It's actually, I've been talking for about 40-some minutes, 45 minutes.
Yeah. Does anybody have a question right here?
Those saxophone, I forgot the name of them now, but
The
Ammonites. It looked like one of your drawings that a lot of those, it looked like the shell might move on those. Is that the case? That they think the shell might have moved, or did you just draw it so that it looked like they might move?
No, the shells are hard, so they would not move, but some of them were uncoiled, so the heteromorph ammonites are not that tightly wound, but they're uncoiled. But some of them are these sort of spiral, loosely uncoiled spirals, and I imagine that they could actually sort of twirl as they floated up and down through the water column, which would be a beautiful sight to see. But basically hard shells, and nobody in the millions of ammonite fossils have been dug up around the world, and they're such beautiful things, worn as jewelry. Nobody's ever found the soft parts of an ammonite, ever. They have beaks just like an octopus. Those have been fossilized, but nobody's ever found any impression of the soft parts. So all of those arms and everything, and the tentacles are all speculation. So.
Talked about bears, but you didn't mention water bears. Where do tardigrades fit in all this?
Uh-oh, you're a biologist, aren't you? The tardigrades are those are the little guys. I would have to go back to. I'd have to consult my scientist friends. I don't know. They're an invertebrate. They are cool little beasties. Yeah, they're not enough life things that fascinate me. We'll just do a couple more questions. Over here, you had one?
Okay. What are your recommendations for the closest museums near Juneau for kids at the best museum?
Well, this is the best museum right here, without a doubt. But other museums to go visit for what? For if you want to go further into like paleo stuff or dinosaurs and that kind of thing. Well, if you get the fossil maps, you will notice we very cleverly have like stuck every cool museum that has any sort of paleo collection on there. But in Alaska, some of the coolest, the Museum of the North in Fairbanks is definitely worth visiting. They are the people that loaned all the fossils that are in this exhibit, and they have some tremendous displays up there. It's a small museum, but it's a really cool museum. But if you ever have the ability to get down to take, if the ferries are still running, go down to Prince Rupert and then drive over to a place called Drumheller. Drumheller in Alberta, at the Royal Tyrrell Museum in Drumheller will blow your mind. It is the ultimate place. I drug my kids there. And then you can actually, there's a provincial park too, this dinosaur provincial park. But Drumheller is well worth journeying to. The Burke Museum is about to reopen, just redesigned. They're going to open again, and they're in Seattle, and they're in opening in October of this year. The Burke Museum is on the UW campus. OMSI is a great museum. The Museum of Natural History down in Eugene, Oregon, that's on campus. The LA County Museum. Those are the ones in the West Coast. Two more. Okay.
And then what are the best archaeological digs that children can participate in? This is for Cub Scouts.
Well, archaeology and paleontology, two different things. You asked for archaeological, that's humans. Paleo is prehistoric, so paleontological. There are many museums actually do have, like, you can go on digs with them, with the crew, and they can take, I think the Museum of the Rockies in Bozeman has a program like that. And then I think Alberta, I think the Drumheller does that too. So, and I think the Denver Museum might as well. Last one. The best hunting spot for fossils in Alaska? Well, there's a lot of the cool, there are, the outer islands in Alaska, there's a lot of cool invertebrate fossils and fossil corals that can be found in Southeast Alaska. There's some leaf sites in Southeast Alaska, but there's a pretty easily accessible one up Palmer, Alaska. That giant footprint from the giant bird and some of those, that was found near Palmer, Alaska, and you can drive right up to those fossil sites, and amateur collecting is allowed there. Always collect knowing the rules of whose land you're on and the rules and regulations. Vertebrate fossils on public lands are public property, and you can't take them home. So anyways, just know the rules. And two more questions.
If you could time travel, what time period would you go to?
If I could time travel, without a doubt, I'd go back to the Devonian. I want to be back there when the fish were crawling out of the water, and I want to see how they're doing that. And imagine they were the first pteronauts. And they are our fishy ancestors, and they had a pineal eye in the middle of the back of their head, so they could, if you kind of snuck up behind them. But the Devonian, life was very strange. There were no flowering plants, and there were no vertebrates up on land. Those fish were the first ones, but there were scorpions that had crawled up on the land, and that was probably a scary, weird place. But the forests were completely different. And I would go to the Devonian without a doubt. If I went to the Cretaceous, I think if you time travel back to the Cretaceous, somebody once said, Jack Horner once said, if you were to time travel back to the Cretaceous, you'd be alive for about 5 minutes. And you would, land there in the Cretaceous, and you'd have a couple of minutes where you'd first realize, it just smelled awful because you'd be standing in dinosaur shit. And there'd be insects all around you, and then within 2 minutes, some beast would, snap you in two, and you'd be dead. In the Devonian, you'd have a fighting chance because you'd be up on land, and in the fish, you'd just watch them up there, and you have to watch out for the scorpions. Anyways. But actually, I would be remiss if I did not show off my Trilo boots here tonight. If they could only talk. They got flames, too, just showing off my Trilo boots. I had to do that. But Kirk's wife, Chase, makes really cool boots. Last question of the evening. The pineal eye. It was a light dark thing. But actually, I think that's really, it's the tuatara is one of the living animals that still has a pineal eye, the third eye. You look at all those ancient, the lobe fin fish that we're descended from, the pineal eye is pretty large, and actually in a lot of the early reptiles and mammalian reptiles, there's still just a very large pineal eye. There's like a third eye, like, I could have a nice eyeball right there. But it's really cool to think, what happened to that pineal eye? It actually probably became the pineal gland, which makes it kind of go, And I think that's where vibrations come from. So I don't know. So with that, thank you for indulging me.